Yeah, so I'm still going here. Okay, great, because now I don't hear the feedback or loop back. So let's get into newer. Knorr might be how you pronounce it. Knorr, that's probably what it is. Um, First, a little biography on Knorr. Um, uh, he passed away in 1990, and there was a obituary in the New York Times. It says Dr. Klaus E. Knorr, Professor Emeritus of Public Affairs at Princeton University and the Director of its Center of International Studies from 1960 to 1968, died yesterday at his home in Princeton, New Jersey. He was 78 years old. So when he wrote this book, he was only 32 years old. This is written in 1944. So he was, I don't think, that long out of grad school because it says that um, his book was the product of his dissertation. I believe at Stanford, but I'm not sure about that. Um, Dr. Knorr, a German-born economist and political scientist, wrote many books developing a thesis that the nuclear age had necessitated a global ascendance of diplomatic and economic policies over military options. Volumes include On the Uses of Military Power in the Nuclear Age, Princeton University Press, 1966. Military Power and Potential, 1970. Power and Wealth, The Political Economy of International Power, Basic Books, 1973. Um, in mid 1968, while the Johnson administration was continuing to accelerate American military involvement in South Vietnam, Dr. Knorr and three associates at the Princeton Center wrote a detailed proposal for the withdrawal of American and North Vietnamese forces, the introduction of an international peacekeeping force, and the formation of a neutral Saigon government. The war continued for 7 more years. Klaus Eugene Knorr was born May 16, 1911, in Essen, Germany, and earned a law degree at the University of Tübingen. He resisted increasing pressure to join the Nazi Party and immigrated to the United States in 1937. So, interesting story to this man. And now for the content of his complex book, which, as Darwin said, is a compendium of almost 3 centuries of British colonial theories, primarily economic theories. And the choice of reviewing this book of my reviewing of this book is premised on the premise that the current printed money mortgage economy, immigration to get people to sign these mortgages, and the welfare state cancer growing off of it will fall. Um, I don't know when that will be, but my interest in past colonial theories in a nationalistic sense, as the British Empire, you know, during this period, although at the end of this period it changed to free trade, was definitely nationalistic in the interest of England and Britain. So these theories are just sort of a contrast to the current globalization situation that has gotten us in Canada, the US, Britain into this uh, economy, if you want to call it that. Um, in an international situation which a country cannot print money ad infinitum, it has to have real products and or services to sell profitably. The difficulty in Canada, the US, and Britain, 3 countries with different economic interests, each country is its own, uh, country and situation. I'm not proposing that they're all the same. Um, the difficulty is that these three countries have been in a dominant position for so long that we no longer pay attention or know how to think or act in an international situation in which one or all of these is no longer dominant. That dominance is over, over. It has been relinquished to China et al. Um, the post-World War II period has seen free trade initially, but now is well into free ownership. This is revolutionary, as in it's not just that there's free trade with other countries, particularly China, but uh, I mean, there's free trade within NAFTA or whatever the agreement that replaced it. But what we're into now is the ownership of commercial and residential assets by other countries, basically freely. And this is a much further step than just free trade, um, and in which China is becoming more and more dominant. That's putting it mildly. Um, an international situation in which Britain or the US hasn't been dominant in the Atlantic and globally hasn't been the case since some point in the 18th century or even the 17th century. So we have to go back so far to uh, put ourselves in the shoes of people from Western countries, particularly these Western countries, before a free trade period. That's why I'm back in the colonial period, um, and the pre 19th century rise of free trade in Britain, Adam Smith, etc. Periods. I just want to look at these for interest's sake. Canada has never existed in an international era during which neither Britain or the US, its traditional allies and main trading partners, were not dominant. So this is uncharted territory. Of course, our political leaders completely nowhere near figuring this out yet, and um, although other countries are way ahead of way ahead of me, so and anyone else in our countries who is thinking about it. So far from a advancing some sort of Western um, you know intelligence in this respect, it's the opposite. We're behind, far behind. Um, Obviously, a country only wants free trade when its industries are dominant. That is, they can produce their products more inexpensively and outcompete industries from other countries in a free trade marketplace, i.e., Britain during the 19th century and the United States during the 20th century, and China in the 21st century. But an equal or subservient competitive international environment hasn't been the case since Britain overtook Spain and France in the 18th century. You know, Britain and the United States, took over and took things to a higher, greater volume than Britain. But to go back to a period when one of those two countries wasn't dominant, we're talking about at least the 18th century. Um, when France and Spain may have been more dominant, arguably more dominant than Britain. So it's a long time ago. Protectionism or mercantilism? Haven't heard that word in centuries. The guffaws with which this group of ideas is met is proof. We are unfamiliar with the concept of national economic self-interest. Um, this is why MAGA, M-A-G-A, mega, in respect to trade, caused and is still causing. Today is April 4th, 2023, and once I'm finished with this podcast, I'm going to turn on the news because apparently President Trump got arrested. But speaking of MAGA, this is why MAGA in respect to trade caused and is still causing a volcanic eruption amongst the chattering classes. Trump started talking about national self-interest in the economic sphere, and nobody knew what he was talking about because that hasn't been the case for so long. Of course, the United States is a different history and economy than Britain, but you know, um, Adam Smith and the uh, change to free trade occurred primarily in Britain in the late 18th century, and then actually took effect during the 19th century. But that whole debate was sort of taken for granted by Canada, certainly, and the US. Of course, they're their own um, discourse in history, economic history, but a lot of the arguments of Smith were just sort of taken as fact. And that's why I'm talking about Britain, even with respect to the US. Um, Mercantilism. Yeah, it's so long ago, nobody even knows what it is, but Klaus Knorr does. Um, Mercantilism. Klaus Knorr is no fan. He's no fan of mercantilism. He looks down his nose at it, but he knows a lot about it and all the different theories that swirled around throughout all those centuries, including Adam Smith. His book is split up the middle. Um, Half the book is, well, there's part one, basically deals with the economic theories up until Adam Smith, and part two deals with Adam Smith and post Adam Smith up to 1850. Okay, so I'm going to get into the actual text here. The foreword of this book is by Harold Innis. Canadian students of history, well, like students of Canadian history in the old school will know Harold Innis, although they probably don't even recommend reading him anymore. But I believe he is known for the Staples theory thesis and wrote about the fur trade. I've read at least one of his books, but it's been a while. University of Toronto, I presume, or the old school Canadian historians. He was definitely prominent, including the other U of T history professors like Careless and Morton and Creighton. Donald Creighton, his gigantic biography of John A. Macdonald. Uh, Innis was amongst those guys, and he writes the foreword to Knorr's book. Not sure why. I guess Knorr thought, well, he's dealing with British colonial theories, so he'd give a nod to Canada and the U of T. it, it must be why he had Innis do the foreword to his book. But Innis reminds us that there were three British empires. Um, at least I'll detail three here. There might have been more. I'm talking about periods of the British Empire. The Old Empire to the Revolution, so from Cabot in, when was it, 1490 something or 50, early 16th century, that Cabot sailed along the coast of North America, and all the way to the American Revolution. That's the old empire. The Second Empire is from the American Revolution to the Reform Acts, which were the liberalization of voting in Britain. And the Reform Act was, or Reform Acts were, oh gosh, well, the repeal of the Corn Laws was 1846, but I'll get the date on the Reform Acts later. But the Third Empire, or the Second Empire, was from the American Revolution to the Reform Acts, and the Third Empire was from after the Reform Acts to the time of his writing in the 1940s. The British Empire was still kicking, although obviously was in the throes with Nazi Germany at its throat. But a maritime economy, Innes points out, tended to be characterized by stability, and a continental economy by violent fluctuations. Never heard that before. He says Dr. Knorr has described the background of the development of flexibility in the British Empire. He's advancing some sort of thesis of the maritime economy being flexible. Britain primarily being a maritime economy, as differentiated from Canada and the US. Although the thing about Canada and the US is they have regions that have different economic interests. So, you know, the northeastern states, Massachusetts particularly, and then New York, were definitely connected to the Atlantic economy, the maritime shipping. So, but Canada and the US would have been less a maritime economy than Britain. So his book here was originally a doctoral dissertation under Professor Viner at the University of Chicago. Innes and Professor V.W. Bladden gave advice. Both those guys are from UT. Interesting that Knorr, as a German who fled the Nazis, is interested in this stuff. Maybe he had some sympathy for the British Empire, but that doesn't mean he thought. He's not of the opinion that it was the good old days before Adam Smith, and he's generally of the opinion that the mercantilists were mistaken and naive. Although Smith was an intellectual, god who put them in their place, but that's a gross oversimplification, as you can tell. So moving on to the intro by Knorr. Knorr says the set of policies to the American Revolution was known as the old colonial system. The old colonial system. Now, where did the colonial system come from? What did it come out of? Knorr says, regarding the external environment which the state and its rulers had to face, this is the early modern state, the early development of mercantilist thought was accompanied by the gradual disintegration and final collapse of the medieval system of European unity and the simultaneous emergence of a number of monarchical nation states which stood to each other in a relation of absolute independence and legal equality. Getting eerie parallels to the current situation, emerging from a system of European unity and the emergence of individual nation states looking out for themselves. Interesting. Knorr says the need of sustained vigilance and preparedness and the psychological condition of omnipresent jealousy, therefore, seem to be the most remarkable features of this state system, the early modern nation state. The psychological condition of omnipresent jealousy. That's one way of describing it, summarizing it. Knorr says that mercantilist thought predates English transatlantic colonies. I think he's referring to England in particular. But this new national self-interest rose out of the disintegration of universal and internationalist ties that had held during the Middle Ages. What replaced medieval unity was the balance of power, or in French, le concert européen, in which modern nation states related more or less by the means of force from a basis of independence and legal equality. So let's get into the 16th century is where he starts. Francis Bacon. Heard of him, but I don't propose to be an authority on a lot of these periods. That's why we have Knorr. Francis Bacon observed that the wealth of both Indies, this is quoting Bacon, quote, the wealth of both Indies seemed in good part but an accessory to the command of the seas. And that's 1651. So I'm sorry, we're in the 17th century there already, but then he also quotes Daniel Defoe from the 18th century. Daniel Defoe wrote, quote, "'Tis for this that these nations keep up such a military force, such fleets and such armies to protect their trade, to keep all the back doors open. Trading nations are obliged to defend their commerce. If the doors of our commerce are shut, we must open them." This talk sounds foreign to us. Haven't heard in a while. And he quotes Charles Davenant, moving on to the late 18th century in the build-up to the American Revolution, 1771. Charles Davenant formulated the principle of trade following the flag. Trade following the flag. To be, quote, from Davenant, to be in a lasting condition to cope with the Dutch in trade, we must, as well in peace as war, have a fleet in readiness strong enough upon all occasions vigorously to assert our dominion of the sea. Trade has ever been observed to follow power and to be influenced by it. No profession of men sooner feels the effects of national increase or decrease in reputation than merchants. Trade has ever been observed to follow power and to be influenced by it. So this is the old colonial system. The mercantilists advocated a number of specific means by which the state's power could be increased and sustained. One, aid to the fishing industry was proposed in order to effect an increase in shipping and a multiplication of mariners. Two, the establishment and enforcement of navigation laws. We'll get into what the navigation laws were. Three, to increase the volume of production. Four, within her national, England being a country without gold and silver mines. So four is England being a country without gold and silver mines, within her national frontiers, an increased stock of precious metals could be procured by A, only by acquiring territories where such mines existed, or B, could be built up through the mechanism of foreign trade. This one thing that's prominent throughout the mercantilist periods is the balance of trade doctrine. Now, one Malinus or Malins relates a classic statement on the old balance of trade doctrine. Malins or Malinus says, if the native commodities exported do weigh down and exceed in value the foreign commodities imported, it is a rule that never fails, that then the kingdom grows rich and prospers in estate and stock, because the overplus thereof must needs come in treasure. This is the balance of trade doctrine, that exports exceeding imports creates a positive balance of trade for that country, and that this is the goal, or a prominent goal, of government policy. Another guy who relates the balance of trade doctrine, Giles Earl, speaking in the House of Commons in 1732, quote, as the great advantage reaped by the nation by any branch of its trade or manufacture depends on exportation. Therefore, when any matter of trade comes to be considered in this House, we ought to regard only those methods or means which may tend to forward the encouraging and promoting the exportation of any manufacture, unquote. Of course, this is what President Trump was, brought up, but the need to encourage American manufacturing. And it was American manufacturing that caused the United States to become the dominant power, just as manufacturing in Britain caused it to become the dominant power before the United States. And with now the transfer of the manufacturing base of the United States, Britain, and every other country to China and other, low-wage countries, obviously those countries, particularly China, are going to replace the United States as the dominant power. It seems that this particular argument probably is guffawed, or has been for 150 years, but the value of manufacturing is conspicuous, that both Britain and the United States, the last and the second last most powerful country in the world, both rose to that position, at least simply corresponding to being the dominant manufacturer. Is that an accident? I'll let people decide that, but there's no doubt that that was a fact in those two instances. Basically the balance of trade argument asserted that the wealth of the nation increased when exports exceeded imports, because the money foreigners used to purchase the excess exports accumulated in England. Thus, both domestic manufacture and export of those restriction manufacture. Thus, both domestic manufacturing export of those manufactures, and restriction on foreign imports were encouraged. A philosophy arose in which trade replaced war as the means to increase power. Because if you could increase the wealth of the country by a positive export surplus, not as bloody as acquiring new territory, until other countries figured out it and did the same thing, of course. Then you might have to go back to war again. Let's see, a quote from Knorr here. He says, a large export surplus was also regarded as the principal means of augmenting the general wealth of the country, and again, comparison with the progress of other nations was considered the chief criterion of prosperity. This mercantilist emphasis on export trade as the source from which any increase in the wealth of a country is derived makes the above observation upon the mercantilist conception of foreign trade also applicable in this case. Some English writers said in effect that a favorable balance of trade would go far towards tipping the balance of power. Postlewaite, who is a name that comes up repeatedly and I still can't pronounce it, having read this book at least 3 times, it's so freaking complicated. Postlewaite, Malachi Postlewaite, 18th century, declared that it was necessary, quote, to throw the balance of trade so effectually into the hands of Great Britain as to put this constant balance of power in Europe into her hands. The same idea was expressed by George Heathcote, who wrote with regard to the peace negotiations between Britain and France, whichsoever of the two nations shall possess a balance of trade in her favor and a right in that great nursery of seamen, must of necessity become the most powerful, both in external and internal strength, and that the weakest must fall a victim to that state power, and that whoever shall, in making a peace with France, make such concessions to her as shall turn that balance and restore her naval power, will infallibly raise the greatness of France out of the ruins of Britain, unquote. One can see the corollary that imports should come from colonies, not rival countries, because to purchase them from rivals would increase their balance of trade. Ergo, empire. So, we're going to step back here and look at the history of the 16th century in this respect. This is chapter 1 of Knorr, chapter 2. Colonial theories 1570 to 1660. So let's put ourselves back in the days of Queen Elizabeth I and the dominant power, world power at the time was Spain. And obviously Spain, having discovered the New World and got off the mark quickest on that, and then when it had the American gold and silver mines tapped, it became the most powerful country in Europe and the world. Spain was the dominant power. According to contemporary English opinion, Spain's power rested mainly on the metallic basis of the treasures received from her American empire. Hence, the English concluded that to cut this stream of wealth, which constantly replenished her coffers, was to hit Spain in the most decisive spot. Naval and military action against Spain would be practicable by the possession of bases in America. So apparently the United States and Canada were originally just considered bases from which to raid, conduct pirate forays against Spain. Uh, from this train of thought sprang another argument in favor of overseas colonization. Already in 1584, Hakluyt had written that those voyage will be a great bridle to the Indies of the King of Spain, for we should not only oftentimes endanger his fleet in the return thereof, but also in few years put him in hazards of losing some part of Nova Hispania, and entring, Entringe, entering into the consideration of the way how this Philip may be abased, King Philip of Spain, of course. I mean first to begin with the West Indies, as there to lay a chief foundation of his overthrow, with an E at the end. If you touch him in the Indies, you touch the apple of his eye, for take away his treasure, which is his nervous belly. In a petition to Parliament in 1624, the Virginia Company enumerated several reasons for the planting of colonies in America. It was claimed that settlements there would be an inestimable advantage that would be gain to this state of England in case of war to ours, both for the easy assaulting of the Spaniards' West Indies from those parts and for relieving and succoring of all ships and men of war that should go on reprisals. Basically, they were pirates on a national scale. Knorr says, what impresses the reader from these 16th century passages most is the close connection between missionary enterprise and trading. The English expected to trade with the natives. And that's what he says. Because of Britain's insularity, naval strength constituted the mainstay of her external power. In order to further maritime strength, the English were keenly interested in possessing a large mercantile marine. As a matrix of sea power, the main function of the merchant marine was that of supplying a large number of skilled mariners. The fact that by navigation ordinances and navigation laws, navigation acts, which I'll describe, foreign vessels could be effectively excluded from the freight business with the colonies was regarded as another advantage. Generally, jealousy and fear of Spain was a major factor in early English exploration and colonization. This is still quoting Knorr. The expectation of finding new sources of supply in the colonies must be regarded as the most potent of all arguments offered in favor of English colonization. So there's prioritizing here. He's saying that the main motivation was to secure sources of secure sources of supply. Nor goes on. At the time in question, the problem of important raw materials frequently carried great political significance. And if this sounds passe, just think about oil at the present time. Obviously, commodities have political importance. At the time in question, the problem of important raw materials frequently carried great political significance. Countries which possessed a quasi-monopoly of a particular produce or controlled the bulk of the world supply available to European nations were often disposed to exploit that opportunity by boosting its price to foreign customers. Saudi Arabia. Portugal, for example, after she acquired Brazil, controlled more than half of the world production of sugar and thus was in a position to manipulate its price. There were still other causes which rendered supplies from foreign countries unduly expensive. Because of the necessity of bribing Russian officials, the expense of maintaining ambassadors, etc., the Russian traded had a, quote, precarious bottom. Again and again, Macpherson reports English complaints that the King of Denmark exacted exorbitant tolls from the English vessels engaged in the Baltic trade. But quite apart from this matter of prices and extra expenses, the monarch, controlling the supply of a particular product, frequently restricted or even stopped its exportation in order to exert political pressure on the importing country. The frequent occurrence of wars often rendered the foreign supply of some merchandise precarious for a time. Finally, the more imports could be diminished, the more likely the achievement of a sizable export surplus. In the light of these reasons, the acquisition of colonial areas which produced or might produce goods hitherto drawn from foreign countries appeared highly desirable. It was this outlook that prompted the formation of the East India Company and the colonization of North America. Knorr is detailing in this chapter, 16th and first half of the 17th century, and explaining the English mercantilist outlook and system developed during this period. Throughout this chapter, he quotes most often from Richard Hakluyt, Hakluit, Hakluit, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. This is for the 16th century. Christopher Carlyle, and above all, Francis Bacon, although Francis Bacon is into the 17th century. Bacon's, quote, Considerations Touching a War with Spain, 1624. His essays, specifically his essay, quote, Of Plantations, unquote. Also his essay Of Seditions and Troubles, unquote. Essay of the True Greatness and Kingdoms, of the True Greatness and Kingdoms, of the True Greatness of Kingdoms and Estates, unquote. Knorr also quotes Edward Williams, 1650, Sir William Mason, 1624. Now we'll move on to the second half of the 17th century. The dividing line he places at the Restoration, the return of the English king after the English Civil War in 1660. So his next chapter, chapter 3, is from 1660 to 1776 to the Revolution. Just going to get a drink of water here. So Colonial Theories, 1660 to 1776, chapter 3. Knorr covers broad sweeps of time, in case you hadn't guessed or observed that. It's interesting to see in the primary sources here that Americans mean Native Americans. From a text in 1685. This guy is arguing, quote, for erecting in London a college, Colledge, de propagande fide, for propagating the Christian religion amongst the Americans bordering on the English plantation. So he's talking about setting up a university for native peoples in London, but that's Americans to him. Where it is a shame, in parentheses, he goes on, this Edward Chamberlain, 1685, where it is a shame to this nation that so few in the space of so many years have been converted to Christianity. Yeah, well, I find the 17th century in America fascinating, particularly a book by oh, Malcolm Gaskill, Between Two Worlds: How the English Became Americans. It's absolutely full of primary sources, and there's a lot on the native peoples in Virginia and Massachusetts. Um, Definitely recommend that book for the 17th century in America and England. But two arguments from 1570 to 1660 stayed and grew. One, strategic considerations vis-a-vis other European powers, and two, trade with the colonies as a nursery for mariners. Um, the breakdown of strategic considerations into four considerations. So, what were these strategic considerations? We're talking about the nuts and bolts of mercantilism, protectionism. So Knorr says strategical considerations were presented in four ways. First, it was thought desirable to retain a colony or acquire new colonial possessions in order to gain a foothold from which to attack the colony of some other power or to harass the colonial trade of an enemy nation in time of war. Thus, Carew Raynal praised the possession of Jamaica because it, quote, is situated so well for trade or for conquest of the main, the Spanish main, that is, mainland of America, if there be occasion, it being the key of the Indies lying in the very belly of all commerce, unquote. Secondly, colonies were welcomed because they seemed to convey on their possessor the mastery of the sea. For example, an anonymous author wrote, quote, whoever holds possession of our colonies in America will keep the sovereignty of the Atlantic Ocean, through which the homeward bound trade from the Eastern and West Indies usually passes. Third strategic economic consideration, it was deemed necessary to take precaution lest the colonial balance of power be shifted against one's own nation. Such a change was apt to affect the security of one's colonies and also to react adversely on the balance of power in Europe. Thus, Postlethwaite, disliking the Northern American colonies, that's Massachusetts, etc., on general grounds, advocated their retention only for one reason, quote, if these colonies should ever fall into French hands, it will not be possible, I apprehend, to maintain a balance of trade and power in America, and who will imagine that we can maintain them after that in Europe? The author remarked, if it be needful, the same author remarked, if it be needful to maintain a balance of power in Europe, why not in Asia among the European powers established there? Will not the rise or decline of their trade and power in the Indies affect that of their particular states in Europe? Unquote. Fourthly, there is the strategic consideration which demands colonial expansion in order to safeguard already existing colonial possessions. A rare modern preference for industries, here shipping, this is an example of a rare modern preference for industries that employ as large a number of people as possible in preference to profit. Of course, the trend in the modern period has been to not value uh, labor or industries that employ the largest number of people possible, but rather the profit of those industries if technology is adopted. But the British emphasis on the shipping industry, the mercantile marine, is an exception for that because they thought that the sailors employed in the merchant marine could easily throw a gun on their ship if war came, and were hardened mariners who could be employed in the Royal Navy in a pinch, i.e., World War II. Uh, So that's rare, an industry being valued for employing the largest number of possible people possible. Um, and that was maintained well into the 19th century. Um, the very remoteness of the colonies was considered to be an advantage from the point of view of training sailors, and so was the fact that colonial staple products were bulky and employ and maintain a great number of ships and mariners. The vital importance of a sufficient supply of skilled sailors determined the English to let considerations of power override considerations of profit. Thus, Sir Francis Brewster wrote, "Other countries may encourage seamen for their advantage in traffic, but we must enlarge and encourage numbers for our security." The pros and cons of population density were also a prominent idea with the mercantilists. Generally, the mercantilists considered a dense, high, and not only high, but dense population important as a positive. It wasn't until Malthus in the late 18th century that population was considered a bad thing. Uh, Especially England considered Holland as the ideal, or the state they were jealous of with their high, densely populated uh, country. And so he says here the pros and cons of population density for a state in primary the pros and cons of population density for a state in the primary sources shows a greater development of thought on the factor of population than we do currently. Um, Although we still consider an increase in population desirable. Um, some quotes from the 18th century, 17th and 18th century on this. Quote, "Fewness of people is real poverty, and a nation wherein are 8 millions of people are more than twice as rich as the same scope of land wherein are but 4. That's Sir William Petty, 1662. A small country well peopled will be able to effect things of more advantage and grandeur than a great dominion ill stocked. 1679. People are therefore in truth the chiefest, most fundamental and precious, with a T, commodity out of which may be derived all sorts of manufactures, navigation, riches, conquests, and solid dominion." And the last one, "I allow that people are the wealth of a nation, yet it can only be so where we find employment for them, otherwise they must be a burden to it." So they weren't just interested in a large population, they were interested in a large employed population. And that gets into the Puritan idea of the Puritan work ethic. Um, that's probably where that touches on that as well. If you were lazy and sitting around, they didn't want you around. Um, Writers who during the 18th century advocated a large domestic English population were Roger Coke, Coke, and William Temple. These are pre-Malthusian views of population. Temple and Coke, quote, "deeply impressed by the stupendous maritime, commercial, and industrial success of the Dutch." It's on page 71. Holland, the model country. According to conventional mercantilism, the wealth of the nation was augmented chiefly by a favorable balance of trade. Again, so English mercantilists concerned with benefits to England and saw colonies primarily in this respect. They were looking out for number one. Um, because they couldn't afford to do otherwise, because the other European nation would invade them um, so English mercantilists concerned with benefits to England. The founder of Georgia, General Oglethorpe, made the nuanced argument that population per se was no necessary benefit to England. Rather, indebted people or people otherwise hard up were a drag on public expenditures and should take their chances in a colony under the English flag and thus benefit England. I think Georgia was originally a penal colony. At some point, it had convicts shipped to it. Um, that's from Oglethorpe's quote, new and accurate account of South Carolina and Georgia and the laws and policy of England relating to trade, 1765. So he's into the 18th century. Just a note on Scotland here, because we keep talking about England, but of course Scotland had its own interests, and um, here's a book, The Interests of Scotland Considered, published Edinburgh 1733, written by Patrick Lindsay, Lindsay, if anyone's looking for the Scottish perspective. The Interest of Scotland Considered. Um, the ever-present dread of foreign monopoly prices. Why mercantilism? The advantage. This is Sir Gilbert Heathcote speaking in the House of Lords, 1721. Quote, the advantage accruing to a maritime power from having its naval stores supplied from its own dominions is no less evident than important. They cannot be withheld in case of war by the prohibition of any prince in whose dominions they must be purchased. Once again, sounds passe, but I was just hearing a news story in the news the last week about rare earth minerals being dominated by uh, certain countries, and these elements are being essential for certain, uh, manufactured items. So this is, of course, this is still the case. We're just don't talk about it. We assume we can just uh, buy all these things from other countries, um, because we assume a free trade environment. But China is not looking out for the interests of the United States or Canada. Um, hello. Um, like, obviously. Uh, and why should they? Because why should they? Um, it was the re-export or entrepot economy, manufacturing, exports, not the English consumer that was the priority. This is a big difference from Adam Smith and post Adam Smith. Consumer was not the primary focus of policy, rather the producer, the manufacturer was. Um, so Knorr says it was less out of regard for the English consumer than to expand the re-export or entrepot trade in colonial staples of such a prodigious value, quote, was attributed to the sugar islands in the West Indies. William Burke, for example, stated this expressively. This is not Edmund Burke, this is William Burke. For example, stated this expressly, those sugar islands who supply the home consumption purvey to our luxury, those who supply the foreign market administer to our wealth and power. That's the manufacturers, the value adders. So we make policy for the value adders and the manufacturers, not the consumer. Erasmus Phillips declared, tobacco, cotton, ginger, sugars, indigo, rice, and the rest of the plantation goods have brought us a balance from France, Flanders, Hamburg, Holland, and the East countries, and above 600,000 pounds a year. Um, the arguments discussed so far centered around two main considerations. First, the substitution of colonial products for foreign commodities, because the foreign uh, governments could restrict the supply of the products they exported to hurt England or whatever other country they were potentially wanted to hurt. Um, Whereas a colony of that European country didn't do that in a time of war. Secondly, the creation of a large English re-export trade in colonial staples. Yeah, once again. Postlethwaite wrote, quote, but keeping our planters to the raising of such materials for our British manufacturers that we are necessitated to take at present from foreign nations and their colonies will effectively prevent jealousies and misunderstandings between Britons and their American brethren and give mutual strength, riches, and power. He says mutual strength, riches, and power. I don't know if the American colonists agreed with him on that, but he's of that opinion anyways. Um, Great Britain's, this is a book title, in quote, Great Britain's True System, London, 1757, Malachi Postlethwaite, who Knorr quotes a lot, wrote, the balance of trade, I cannot too often repeat it, is in fact the balance of power. The balance of trade is in fact the balance of power. I don't think that yeah, if it's true, the United States is, what's the Canadian and American balance of trade with China? It's absurd. And the balance of power has followed it. So it appears to have a point. Um, Protectionism, that is mercantilism, as common in the other Western European countries as Britain. I mean, we're focusing on Britain here, but the other European countries were doing the same thing. They were all looking out for numero uno. The argument in favor of colonies that was emphasized the most was the colonies as providing markets. So not only as sources of supply, but also markets for English exports, British exports. Markets internal to the empire. Um, the argument of the markets or the colonies as markets probably increased as the population of the colonies grew, but it's also a factor in their thinking. Um, while the old colonial system reigned supreme between 1660 and 1775, Trade was the main objective pursued through colonization in colonies. Brian Edwards, historian of British West Indies, wrote in 1819, quote, "Commercial monopoly is the leading principle of colonial intercourse, unquote." So unabashed monopoly is the simple goal achieved by every means, violent and otherwise. I'm talking about between European countries. As for violence to native peoples, it's definitely something that gives pause, but we're talking about history here, so I'm just looking at economic theories. This obviously is not a social history I'm detailing. I'm just relating economic theories. The old colonial system up to the American Revolution. Knorr says, while the old colonial system reigned supreme, i.e. between 1660 and 1775, trade was the main objective pursued. Sir William Keith pronounced that redressing, quote, "the balance of national trade if it is turned against it," unquote, was the only advantage for planting was the only adequate objective for planting colonies. In the course of the Canada-Guadeloupe controversy, when I think that the British were considering throwing Canada away for the island of Guadeloupe, which they decided not to do, William Burke, this isn't Edmund Burke, this is William Burke, admonished his countrymen to let their policy be guided by consideration of commerce only. In 1774, John Campbell stated, this is after the fall of New France in the mid 18th century. In 1774, John Campbell stated, "There are certain principles so clear and evident that to this we may attribute the idea of fixing settlements in distant countries for the sake of commerce." It's like assumed. That's why we're founding colonies. It's not to go on crusade, or it's to increase our wealth and power, our power first of all, and then our wealth. They didn't second guess themselves or look out for someone else's interests above their own. Why? Maybe because we're talking about pre-industrial times when the European populations were still apt to starve from time to time. So looking out for somebody else before yourself was not it's nowhere to be seen. It didn't even occur to anybody. Apparently, at least not in government or in business. In religion, it may have occurred to people. These citations could easily be multiplied. But England's upper class, I put the caveat here, what England primarily looked for in the colonies was neither extension of territory per se, nor oversea aggregation of Englishmen, but goods and markets. Thus, colonization had virtually created markets and sources of goods where there had been none before, and in this sense, it had certainly increased the total of the world's trade. That's definitely true. The discovery of America resulted in a huge increase of trade over the Middle Ages, and increasingly as time went on. Brian Edwards, he's a historian of the English West Indies, and the triangular trade between Europe, North America, the West Indies, Europe was the trade loop, the Atlantic trade loop, ever since. Starting with Columbus and the first American English settlements in America, 3 point trade loop. Now, Knorr, just to clarify, he condescends all this mercantilist stuff because he's writing in the mid 20th century, so he puts in the adjective fallacious mercantilist conceptions of it, the fallacious mercantilist conceptions of international trade. So, but he faithfully details what they thought, and that's all I'm doing here primarily. The empire was visualized as a large commercial unit consisting of England, Scotland, Ireland, and the plantations. That's what America is referred to, and Canada wasn't even thought of yet. The empire was visualized as a large commercial unit consisting of England, Scotland, Ireland, and the plantations in America as separate but cooperative complements. Certainly weren't unambitious in their worldview. In Canada, if you even try to produce a product in one province and sell it in the next, it's considered unheard of. And these people have a basically global unit, a large commercial unit. Their commercial relations were to be strictly of a complementary, not a competitive character. That's an important factor. Ideally, of course, it didn't work out that way. Eventually. Similar ideas showing a tendency to rely on intra-imperial autarky, even in the matters of markets for metropolitan goods, were uttered by Daniel Defoe and General Oglethorpe. So there were people who wanted a closed system with complementary units. That's a pretty big system. However, in the case of most writers, notions of imperial self-sufficiency were limited to Britain's need for raw materials. Even in this respect, there appeared hardly any sentiment voicing the desire of seeing the mother country completely independent from foreign supplies. So we're talking about majority in these industries and factors. It's not that foreign trade didn't occur, or importation, exportation. They primarily wanted to rely on sources of supply under their own control, primarily, not exclusively. On the other hand, it was never suggested that metropolis limit its output to the demands of the empire, and same on the exports. On the contrary, the largest possible expansion of sales abroad was generally desired for metropolitan as well as colonial products. Many writers indeed regarded the colonies as nothing but a business enterprise undertaken by the mother country. But at least in the case of Canada, I don't think this applies to the United States as much, but the prominence of trading in the fur trade, of not, going in and killing the native people, but of trading with them because you were in business with them. It's one of the main reasons why Canada was not as violent as the United States. So this idea of looking primarily approaching other peoples as in terms of trade is not it's not as sinister as approaching them in some genocidal conception or conquest. Although it's still extremely cynical, of course. Now we get on to Edmund Burke in the late 17th century. We're moving on here. Burke likewise was against taxing the Americans without their consent. He also proposed reconciliation as the only wise policy to be pursued. So obviously the American colonists weren't happy with this whole grand arrangement, or some of them weren't happy. In matters of political, constitutional, and economic theory, he was by far superior to the narrow-minded Chatham. He's praising Edmund Burke here. Yet, apart from the issues referred to above, his attitude was one of ambiguity. He realized precisely the function of the navigation laws, and I'm going to detail the navigation laws. But he did not advocate the repeal or even their modification. Burke was initially a protectionist, but then he was won over by Adam Smith at a certain point, I believe. In April 1774, Burke said in the House of Commons, quote, "Permit me to lead your attention back to the act of navigation, the cornerstone of the policy of this country with regard to its colonies." Sir, that policy was from the beginning purely commercial, and the commercial system was wholly restrictive. It was the system of a monopoly. No trade was let loose from that constraint, but merely to enable the colonists to dispose of what, in the course of your trade, you could not take, or to enable them to dispose of such articles as we forced upon them, and for which, without some degree of liberty, they could not pay. Hence all your specific and detailed enumerations. Hence the innumerable checks and counterchecks, hence that infinite variety of paper chains by which you bind together this complicated system of the colonies. So Edmund Burke calls the empire that infinite variety of paper chains by which you bind together this complicated system. It's primarily a business relationship between the different parts of the empire. At least in Burke's mind, but in the mind of the mercantilists more generally. This is the conception of intra-imperial autarky, voiced by Daniel Defoe and General Oglethorpe. Knorr notes the, quote, almost complete absence of that sentimental imperial brotherhood idea. So it's not sentimental. They were just trying not to starve still to a large extent until the Industrial Revolution. Rather, colonies nothing but a business enterprise undertaken by the mother country. Okay, so now I'll finally detail the navigation acts that Burke calls the cornerstone of the policy of this country with regards to colonies. So for this I have, because there wasn't just one navigation act, there was numerous, but some more important than others. So it's from the Encyclopedia of American History. The Acts of Trade and Navigation, 1650 to 1767. So the first Navigation Act was instituted or passed in the House of Commons, or passed in any case by Cromwell during the English Civil War, 1650, which is called the Interregnum, the period of the English Civil War when Cromwell was ruler. So in 1650, the Navigation Act that was passed was to liberate English trade from Dutch control. Parliament, these acts were made up of one, the element that forbade foreign ships from trading in the colonies without special license. That's October 3, 1650. Two, enacted 9 October 1651, that no goods from Asia, Africa, or America could be imported into England, Ireland, or the colonies except in ships of which the owner, the master, and a major part of the crew were English, including colonials. 3. That no European goods could be imported into England, Ireland, or the colonies except in English ships or ships of the country of origin. 4. Prohibits, this is still all from the 1651 Act, prohibited foreign goods from being imported into England except from the place of production. 5. Prohibited the importation of fish by aliens. 6. Excluded all foreign ships from the English coasting trade. These comprehensive acts depended for enforcement upon informers. Ooh. So the government wasn't big enough to enforce this. So it was based on informers and the colonial governors. Complaints arose of the hardships of enforcement owing to England's lack of shipping to replace the Dutch. The governors of Barbados and Antigua complained of supply shortages, 1652, 1656, and the former colony petitioned for repeal of the Act of 1650. The Virginia Assembly, the precursor of Thomas Jefferson, the Virginia Assembly declared that freedom of trade would be maintained and all merchants protected. They're bold in 1655 because they supported the king in the English Civil War. That's why. That's 1655. Cromwell wouldn't have none of that, probably. Demanding bond of all sea captains not to molest foreign shipping. That's the Virginia Assembly passing its own laws in this respect. Massachusetts in 1655, Rhode Island 1657, and Connecticut 1660 publicly announced their intention of continuing trade with the Dutch. So they were feeling pretty good about themselves. On the other side of the Atlantic, didn't think that Cromwell would do anything about that. And maybe they were right, because by the time they got around to doing much about it, we're at 1660 at the Restoration. Now, an important point is that the king, or the king's son, when he returned at the Restoration in 1660, he continued this self-interest that had been started by Cromwell. They didn't change. They passed more Navigation Act 1660 and confirmed by the first regular Restoration Parliament, 27 July 1661, provided that no goods or commodities, regardless of origin, could be imported into or exported out of any English colony except in English-built or owned ships, of which the master and 3/4 of the crew were English. 2. Required that enumerated articles, including sugar, tobacco, and indigo of colonial growth and manufacture, be shipped only to England and her colonies, with ships sailing from the colonies required to give bond that they would unload enumerated commodities in the realm. So certainly looking out for numero uno and crushing the Dutch, who were the dominant trading nation at the time. You know, these navigation acts continued to be British policy, or English and British policy, all the way up to 1767, you know, in the lead up to the American Revolution. Still in 1767, and another navigation act, or just confirming the previous act. In 1767, all non-enumerated goods destined for any part of Europe north of Cape Finisterre were required to be shipped first to England. Where is Cape Finisterre? Good heavens. Oh, it's in northwestern Spain. It's the northwest tip of Spain. So anywhere, all non-enumerated goods destined for any part of Europe north of Cape Finisterre were required to be first shipped to England. But most things already were by that time. By 1770, it is estimated that from the time of first enumeration, 96% of the tobacco exported from the colonies had to be re-exported from England. Had been re-exported from England. 79% of rice, 40% of indigo, 58% of beaver skins, 95% other furs. So the system was definitely not only enforced but up and running all the way to the American Revolution, basically. Everything was shipped to be processed and manufactured, value added and manufactured in England. That was the system, the old colonial system. Knorr notes that nor is it possible to detect any noteworthy disagreement between Whigs and Tories on this economic system. As a whole, the influential in England stood for empire as a good business proposition and for laws that, in their eyes, appeared to make this business as profitable and secure as possible. It was the rise of the Liberal Party in the 19th century that advocated free trade. The Whigs and the Tories, the Whigs being the predecessor to the Liberal Party, but not the same of it, in particular in this economic respect, they were they were okay with the old colonial system. Yet from the beginning, English merchants were the principal agents of colonization, not the aristocrats, though they were landowners. It was the merchants, but the English politicians, the aristocrat, were fine with the system. Merchants had been instrumental in the establishment of the Navigation Acts. Anyone who reads the records of the British Parliament, especially those of the House of Commons, is impressed by the ubiquity and influence of the merchant interest in all matters relating to the colonies. There is little, if any, exaggeration in the judgment of Adam Smith, who declared, "Of the greater part of the regulations concerning the colony trade, the merchants who carry it on, it must be observed, have been the principal advisers. We must not wonder, therefore, if in the greater part of them their interest has been more considered than either that of the colonies or that of the mother country." So Smith was critical, and he conceived of things as an expose of the dastardly merchants who were supposedly ripping everybody off. So I'm taking a break here, then I'm going to go into part two. That is the old colonial system up to the American Revolution. I'm taking a break here, then we'll deal with Adam Smith afterwards. War on drugs there. Cheers to war on drugs. Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut that short. Get back to business here. Literally. Because we're talking about Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith, of course, the publication in 1776 of an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, a colossal book. Knorr says, this book owed its eminent significance to two principal reasons. On the one hand, it contained the first systematic assault on mercantilism as a system of doctrinal elements and of policies implemented by the state. On the other hand, it initiated economics as an academic science, although it was called at the time political economy. Obviously, Adam Smith's accomplishment in both respects produced far-reaching and revolutionizing repercussions on English patterns of theorizing on the subject of colonies. Before resuming the examination of colonial theories, it seems advisable, therefore, to review briefly the main features of this change in economic thinking. I'm not going to detail Smith because I'm not reviewing The Wealth of Nations, but I have to detail him to a large extent anyways. But I have to confess that I'm going to skim things because Smith and a lot of these late 18th and Enlightenments and in the early 19th century authors I find them verbose and hard to read. The swashbuckling, gun blasting pirates of Sir Walter Raleigh and Drake and all that. It's more, it's certainly a little bit more panache. Of course, that's not what Smith was after. But anyways, so Adam Smith and the Benthamites, that's Jeremy Bentham, quote, contributed greatly to the success of the cause of liberalism. This is liberal. You have to be nice to other people now. And that being nice to them is going to benefit you more than looking out for yourself first. It's dumbing down the argument quite a bit, but that's basically true. The movement that affected the final repeal of the Corn Laws and the abolition of imperial tariff preference and the Navigation Acts were one and the same. So this is a giant force that really, dealt a blow to the old colonial system and ushered in Britain as a free trade force for free trade. Smith's conclusion, quote, that the utility of colonization and colonies was not well understood in his time. Quote, it constituted so much of an improvement over previous periods of English theorizing that in respect to this subject, his work may be called truly revolutionary. That's Knorr speaking in the second quote. Revolutionary. Knorr once again shows what his true sentiments are. He says, another notion which had confused the minds of the mercantilists, so he's patting the mercantilists on the head. Um, the mercantilists, as has been pointed out, cared on the whole very little about the mass of the people as consumers. This attitude was almost reversed by the classical economists. Henceforth, cheapness of consumers' goods, whether produced at home or imported from abroad, was regarded as the main objective of economic theory. It's a big change. And you can tell, going to a mall in the United States or Canada nowadays, because you can tell that the direction of policy is on the consumer because they all weigh about 300 pounds. Although they consume more goods at that weight. Um, so Smith, basically a god, uh, to Knorr at least. Knorr says, as has become sufficiently evident from the review of British colonial theories in Part 1 of the present study, Smith's conclusion that the utility of colonization in colonies was not well understood in his time. Pat was certainly not an overstatement. Oh, so he agrees with Smith on that. Indeed, his treatment of the subject doubtless constituted so much of an improvement over previous English theorizing that in respect to this subject his work may be called truly revolutionary. While in the field of economic theory and general commercial policies numerous predecessors had anticipated his contributions, in the field of colonial theories, in the application of the principles of theoretical economics to the subject of colonial trade, he had virtually none. In his specific field, too, all something was left to his successors was to expand. All that was left to his successors was to expand, elaborate, qualify, and above all, disseminate his godlike conclusions. The second last word is mine. On the subject of colonies, then, the wealth of nation marks the most revolutionary advance in the evolution of British thought. The most revolutionary advance in the evolution of British thought. It's quite the claim. May be true. You'd have to say it certainly ranks up there. Um, the effects that it's had not only on Britain but on the United States, Canada, and the world. You know, ushering in the idea of free trade and of course other uh, innumerable other ideas in the wealth of nations. But um, Adam Smith argues the foundation of a great empire, quote, for the sole purpose of raising up a people of customers, he argued, was a project, quote, extremely fit for a nation whose government is influenced by shopkeepers, unquote. So pretty condescending. One reviewer remarked that in his discussions of imperial questions, Adam Smith was something like a man who mounted his horse and rode off in opposite directions. Yeah, and Knorr acknowledges that Smith is an author so prone to insert qualifications when submitting major principles. Smith's extremely long-winded style. Um, an author so prone to insert qualifications when submitting major principles, so you can't never be really sure exactly what he thinks. Since the machinery by which the monopoly of the colony trade was maintained had been incorporated in the Navigation Acts of 1660 and numerous subsequent amendments, the abolition of the one would have involved the partial repeal of the other. Yet, although denouncing the Navigation Act on economic grounds, Smith approved of it in the following passages in his book. So he's approving to it and disagreeing with it. Quote, as defense, however, is of much more importance is of much more importance than opulence, the act of navigation is perhaps the wisest of all commercial regulations of England. That's Smith speaking. But I thought he wanted to change all that. But he nuanced. Smith is very nuanced. To these writers, his disciples, Adam Smith appeared as a liberal imperialist, of which he was the first of many. The Liberal Party in Britain was still uh, imperialist, but they just thought of advancing Britain's interests by free trade, which, as the main manufacturing country, they were able to do. And that's one of the main conclusions that I have, is that free trade makes sense when a country is the dominant uh, country in particular industries, because it can outcompete in a free trade environment. But if it's not the dominant power in those industries, it's not going to win in a free trade environment. Another country is, particularly manufacturing, although in everything. Um, so free trade is in the interest of a particular country with particular industries at a particular time, but it's not in the interest of a particular country with particular industries at a particular time in other instances. It depends on the situation. Free trade based on the assumption of reciprocity. This is important too, because the British, I think everybody agrees, but in the 19th century were high on their horse, pretty arrogant. They assumed that other countries would reciprocate in their magnanimous extension of free trade, because England was confident, or Britain was confident enough that it could just send the navy in and blast away if they disagreed. But and same with the United States after World War II, arrogant, overconfident. What if another country doesn't want to reciprocate and it's looking out for itself? It's a different situation. Free trade based on the assumption of reciprocity. Adam Smith declared, quote, Great Britain derives nothing but loss from the dominion which she assumes over her colonies. But I thought you agreed with the Navigation Acts. So he's contradicting himself there. Knorr says, Adam Smith's sober judgment was that the mother country was financially sapped by the colonies, which she had to govern and defend. So Smith was poo-hooing the empire in an extremely erudite and uh, pedantic way. It seems to the present writer, this is Knorr speaking, that Adam Smith was, to a large and decisive extent, a thinker who subscribed to the ideas and sentiments of the 18th century Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment being prominent. And this highlights an aspect of Adam Smith that I have heard a little bit about, but I would like to hear from people who know more about it. And hopefully, once I get this chat working a little better, we get comments on things like this and things that I don't know about, because I don't propose to know about a lot in these sweeping periods. Nobody except Knorr can know about all this stuff, all these different periods. My education's in classics and um, my hobbies in Canadian history and British history and American history a little bit, but I don't propose to be an authority on all these periods. But the extent to which Adam Smith was a product of the Enlightenment, as we know, the Scottish Enlightenment, the Enlightenment was strong in Scotland and in France, but France certainly was the inveterate enemy of England, and Scotland used to be the enemy of England, but then they uh, you know, formed Britain in the early 18th century. But I'm uncertain how, if Smith was such a product of the Enlightenment, are his ideas genuinely in the interests of Britain, or is he an Enlightenment thinker? Is he Rousseauan? Is he one of the main things that makes me think is that Smith, from I believe, used to hang out in Paris at the salon and philosophize with the various um, philosophes, no lovers of England, and yet he's known as supposedly this oracle that to the benefit of England. So it's you wonder about the whole thing he advised. You skip ahead 150 years, and the British Empire is going down the tubes. So, and yet in the 19th century, his ideas appeared to increase the power of the British Empire. So I'm not going to make a judgment of Adam Smith. It's a little bit too complicated of an individual for me to, and it's not my goal. I'm just relating facts here and bringing out interesting points that I'm observing, particularly because we're in a new international situation here with the rise of a new dominant world power. Um, so it's bringing all these ideas of free trade versus national self-interest to the front burner again. Um, the liberal dissenters, of course, predate the 19th century. The nonconformists in England were the Protestants who were not part of the Church of England. The nonconformists, the dissenters, although they generally would have descended from the Whig side and Cromwell in the English Civil War, but they were always suspicious of the crown, obviously, and big, grandiose expenditures in colonial wars on behalf of the crown. They were suspicious of that, at certain points, anyways. And in the 19th century, they latched on to the liberal economics and free trade. And this is detailed by Knorr, the dissenters in the American War of Independence. So he's looking at their views on that. But as for their views of Smith, quote, the liberal dissenters were ever inclined to be jealous of any augmentation of the state's power. Now that's fair. That's fair. I don't see any problem with that. Um, the determination of the English ruling group to coerce the American Democrats into submission threatened immensely to increase the power at the disposal of the king and, quote, the king's friends. Therefore, the dissenters struggled against this evil war with manful courage. I think the Tories were in power when Britain decided to fight the American colonists in the Revolution, or were forced to. So the dissenters, the Whigs demurred on that, or some of them. But even apart from this purely political issue, they criticized the policy of the government because even a successful war would earn the mother country nothing but losses in men and money. So they're penny pinching too. This penny pinching, you could see them being criticized as. Quote, America recovered by the sword must be kept by the sword, and forts and garrisons must be maintained in every province to all the wretched inhabitants. I think the Americans like this language, but this is from the ones arguing in favor of them. I wondered the Tories obviously would have been even worse. Forts and garrisons must be maintained in every province to awe the wretched inhabitants. This will create another additional expense. That's all they care about. The colonies, desolated and impoverished, will yield no revenue. So this is the only reason they objected to uh, the king and his conquests. Is that the colonies won't yield a revenue in that instance. So just trade with them and let them have political independence and trade with them, and then and trade will increase and the government uh, won't have a deficit. This is apparently what they were thinking about. Concerned with the rapid increase of the public debt and a passion for financial economy, which is a big liberal platform in the 19th century, were other considerations that influenced the attitude of the dissenters. It was mainly these aspects which finally reconciled to this group to the loss of the North American colonies. The American colonies, not Canada. Nor. Shortly before the Peace of Paris was concluded, Price noted, Richard Price, in 1783, happily for the kingdom, a peace must be obtained, and had the terms on which it has been obtained brought us more within the limits of this island and eased us more of the expense of foreign dominion, I should have thought it only more a blessing to us than mankind. Little Englanders, this is what they were accused of being, I believe. Let us turn our thoughts another way and recollect that the loss of Minorca and the liberation of America, pretty gutsy for this guy to call the loss of the war by Britain the liberation of America, have already produced great savings. So that's all he cared about, was it saved the government a few bucks. No, but that's his opinion, which it probably did. As the above review of dissentient thought shows, the liberal nonconformists had no comprehensive theory of empire. Their principal interest, moreover, was focused on the political and constitutional rather than on the economic issues involved. By the way, if my neighbor starts pounding on the wall, that's just part of living in a high rise in Vancouver, okay? Yet it seemed justifiable to devote to the discussion of their views more than a few sentences because, as a social class, they were to become increasingly influential as the process of industrial revolution gathered momentum. The liberal star was ascendant. Even their purely political philosophy, their hostility towards the traditionalism of the Tories or of Burke and like-minded Whigs. So this is a split in the Whigs and the creation of the Liberal Party in Britain. And their constant demand for the complete secularization of politics and their laissez-faire ideals, especially as expressed in philosophical radicalism and Manchesterism, it's the Manchester School of Economics, were to exert considerable influence on the shaping of colonial theories, generally in the 19th century. Who were these liberal dissenters? John Bright, Richard Cobden. Moving on into chapter 7, after the American Revolution, we're in 1776 to 1815, and Adam Smith's, subsequent to the publication of Wealth of Nations. Knorr says, it may be true that the English people fell into a kind of disgust with colonial matters, and that the nation was filled with confusion and lethargy as regards colonial affairs. Yet mingled with disgust and confusion was the dogged determination to hold fast to the possession and exploitation of the remnants of the old empire. Before 1783, the opinions of the intellectual leaders of public opinion were on the whole in line with that of the bulk of influential groups. After 1783, a situation arose in which the intellectual elite of Great Britain, eminently articulate on the colonial question, was opposed by the broad mass of influential groups which were rather inarticulate and chary of expressing reasoned opinions on the subject. So the elite sort of were going towards free trade, whereas the masses still had a sentimental attachment to empire. I think that's what he's saying. Nevertheless, this majority seemed to know exactly what they wanted and were apparently unperturbed by the argumentative broadsides of their intellectually superior opponents. Smith, namely. Public opinion on any matter and at any time is determined by, this is Knorr speaking. Public opinion is determined by an incredibly confused maze of thoughts and sentiments, prejudices and traditions more or less closely related to the supposed interests of the specific carrier of opinion. To disentangle, weigh, and label these various constituent elements with precision in any concrete case defies the analytical tools at the disposal of the observer. Well, at least he's honest as well as condescending. Yet, in the special case here under consideration, the following rough conclusions may be hazarded without too much risk. In the spheres of traditionalism and of national pride of empire, the attachment of large influential groups to the symbols of empire remained impervious to intellectual arguments. Large sections, no doubt, were prevented from grasping these arguments because they were intellectually too lazy, incapable, or unschooled. Wow. So it's that the English and Scottish people were too stupid to understand Adam Smith, that they didn't immediately change course, according to Knorr. Just a few secondary sources on this period. John Davidson, Commercial Federation and Colonial Trade Policy. That's published 1900. It's obviously fairly obsolete, probably. And Manning, British colonial government after the American Revolution. But I'll get into some more recent 21st century sources by relating Darwin's further reading section on recent scholarship on all this. Of course, Knorr is published in the mid 20th century. But that doesn't mean he doesn't know anything about it. It's just he obviously does. Before 1783, yeah. Immediately after the Peace of Paris, the center of imperial interest shifted to Canada in the west and to India in the east. So the Peace of Paris was the peace signed between the Americans and the British after the Revolutionary War, I believe. So after the Revolution, imperial interest shifted to Canada in the west and India in the east. Some important secondary sources are related. Knorr goes on. Under the auspices of the old colonial system, an important triangular trade developed between Great Britain, the English West Indies, and the North American colonies. That's the triangular Atlantic trade loop that I was talking about. The mercantilists had regarded large population as the sine qua non. I talked about that. But another big book or intellectual work like Smith's Wealth of Nations with Malthus's essay in 1798. Therein, Malthus advances the existence of a natural law whereby population increases faster than the means of subsistence. These guys are pretty miserable, it has to be noted. They may have been right, but for the time. Before revolution, the American Revolution, empire was economic. After, it was the need to be liberal, to be nice to other people. Sentimental liberalism added. Malthus, a believer in laissez-faire. So Malthus was a Smithite. The first attack on the Navigation Acts was defeated. So Smith didn't just take the place of the king. It took a long time before free trade and laissez-faire was accepted by the British government. The first attack on the Navigation Acts was staved off by the Earl of Sheffield's school of thought, which represented ship owners and shipbuilders, and in particular, Prime Minister Pitt's American Intercourse Bill was defeated. That was in Pitt's American Intercourse Bill defeated 1806. So the mercantilists, protectionists, imperialists were still in the driver's seat. Adam Smith opened the barrage on the old imperial economic system, but after him, no progress in classical economics until David Ricardo. Ricardo's book, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, 1817. So we've got Adam Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo spread over 20, 30-year period. Ricardo's The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, 1817. Ricardo therein saw both harm and benefit in the old system. So Ricardo, like Smith was very nuanced. And Ricardo also saw harm and benefit in the old colonial system. Jeremy Bentham's plan for a universal and perpetual peace sounds 21st century or 20th century as well. And this is the precursor to all that. The liberal world economic order, the liberal world social order. James Mill, another name. Knorr also considers not much of an economist. Okay, Knorr's got his reservations about James Mill as an economist. These men scorned, quote, the unreasoning attitude with which the nation approached this subject, the Navigation Acts. The dismal science is what economics, classical economics was known as by its opponents. The dismal science. Penny pinching and no more blasting away off the decks of ships in roaming the seas to steal the Spaniards' gold and all this kind of thing. No, none of that. You gotta be rational and look out for other people's interests. Apparently, you can't take things straightforwardly. There's a higher plane of enlightenment that you have to be aware of. If not, you're an imbecile. Early liberalism denoting individual liberty from large wasteful government. But that was the case long before the 19th century. The Whigs were more libertarian And whereas actual liberalism is more associated with the 19th century and the Liberal Party in Britain or Canada, or the Reform Party was called in Canada originally in the 19th century. So Knorr had his reservations about Mill, but he has a glowing summary of Bentham. And I'm skipping ahead big time here because this is, I find these authors, these free trade authors, difficult to read. To the Benthamites, excessive government expenditure was objectionable not only because it denoted a spirit of wastefulness. Oh, how dare you! Necessitating heavy taxation, unwarranted expenditure enabled the few to exploit the many and constitute an unjustifiable infringement on the liberty of the individual citizen by restricting his freedom to dispose of his property. Probably true, but gosh, he sure thought about things. Thus, their objections to excessive revenues and expenditure were part of his desire and struggle for a liberal and utilitarian system of government. James Mill declared, "It never ought to be forgotten that society is injured by every particle of unnecessary expense." Oh, what a dour, um, the dismal science, the dismal science. Whereas you contrast this with the speech addressed to the first colonists who left England for New Zealand in 1839. Archibald Allison said, "In the steady consideration of these, and the persevering encouragement of enterprises such as the present, it is to be found the means of obviating all our difficulties. Persevering encouragement. The sheet anchor of the British Empire. Persevering encouragement." That's in 1839. Though he was positive and probably quixotic and romantic. Let's go sail to New Zealand around the far side of the world and have a jolly old time. Whereas Bentham would have said, or Mill, how much is that going to cost? He was probably right by that criteria. But can you measure everything by such an approach? Again, James Mill wrote, "It has been enough explained that it is only capital which gives employment to labor. We may therefore take it as a postulate. A certain quantity of capital, then, is necessary to give employment to the population, which any removal for the sake of colonization may leave behind. Okay? But if to afford the expense of that removal, so much is taken from the capital of the country that the remainder is not sufficient for the employment of the remaining population, there is in that case a redundancy of population and the evils which it brings." Good heavens! It's just how do you read that stuff? A whole book like that? Good heavens! So, but the mercantilists were no longer cool. You know, Smith was cool, and so this was the trend. All the way up into the present day. Um, even the names. This sounds like passe. We have the case for colonization without free trade. So they were still, the old school was still holding their ground. This guy, Major Torrens, in the early 40s, Torrens was also opposed to the repeal of the Corn Laws because he anticipated that such a step, though extremely favorable to the manufacturing industries, would destroy British agriculture. Quote, "Master manufacturers, in their increased prosperity, might have an increased demand for villas, for horses, and for ornamental domains. Operatives in full employment and ample wages might consume increases of qualities of animal food." All these economic figures and entries in an account book. But when the cornfields of England should have been converted into parks and meadows, what would become of the peasant? The introduction of free trade in corn, therefore, would force Great Britain to resort to emigration and colonization on a gigantic scale in order to preserve masses of the rural population from perishing from the face of the earth. And he was right about that. But revenues and the GDP certainly increased by that means. Um, a number of writers adopted a similar outlook. Well, let's continue on with what happened to Torrens. In the long run, Torrens thought reliance on the benefits of an extension of foreign trade was particularly precarious because foreign countries increasingly rivaled the industrial efficiency of England. So he was looking ahead. And he said, yes, we move to free trade, but what happens when other countries catch up to us and pass us, and we're no longer able to outcompete them to produce goods for the lowest price in a free trade environment? In that situation, you would have wanted an extensive empire that was connected to you politically. But that appears to draw a conclusion that in the short term, in the 19th century, free trade benefited England as long as it was still the dominant manufacturing power, just like free trade benefited the United States in the 20th century as long as the dominant manufacturing power. But as soon as other countries catch up to them, free trade loses its appeal. But we haven't gotten to that point. Our leaders, except for President Trump, who was just completely out of the blue on that, nobody has gotten to that point. And yet, to assert that the United States and Canada or Britain are the dominant manufacturing countries is absurd. We're resting on old laurels. So I'm being critical still though of some of the motives of these free traders. To what extent was even early economic liberalism, that's late 18th, early 19th century, i.e., purporting to care about the price the poor were paying for bread to repeal the Corn Laws, just using them to tear down the empire and the traditional conservatives and Whigs who were its proponents? How much was this free trade argument just because the middle class was ascendant and more populous? How much was this interest for them as consumers over the interests of the traditional Whigs and Tories, the aristocrats, just because they had more votes and not because it was in the long-term interests of Britain? And the same dynamic between the political parties and the electorate goes on now, is that although you'd have to say, well, with Brexit and the election of President Trump, you'd have to say that the British and American populations voted at least 50%, right around 50%, for a return to national self-interest. So things have changed. That those are major events, but the politicians are still overconfident, I would say, or they're still in the old system where the West was rulers of the world, which is no longer even remotely the case. In any case, it's probably safe to say that economics was assumed by both Whigs and Tories to be subservient to the nation and empire. This is the main change from protectionism in the old colonial system to free trade in was that the mercantilists considered power and politics to be the most important, and wealth was secondary to that, whereas the free trade considered wealth to be the most important, and that power would flow from wealth. And in a situation where Britain was dominant militarily and the United States is dominant militarily, wealth, they're able to focus on wealth primarily. But in a situation where they're not dominant militarily and politically, does the interest have to be placed on politics and on national self-interest first over wealth in the consumer? It just depends on the situation. I'm not making a statement in favor of protectionism or against free trade in every circumstance. It depends on the international situation. Liberalism and internationalism. There's a lot of talk now about globalization, but there's not as much acknowledgement that globalization came out of free liberalism, 19th century British liberalism. There's a lot of criticism of globalization nowadays, but we forget how it rose to prominence. And of course, the 20th century advanced that politically by means of the League of Nations and the United Nations. But economically, it was increasingly called globalization as opposed to classical economics or free trade, laissez-faire. Major Torrens, The Losing Side. Some works of Torrens, quote, Essay on the Production of Wealth, 1821, quote, Colonization of South Australia, 1836, The Budget, 1841, A Letter to Sir Robert Peel, 1843, Wakefield, The Art of Colonization, 1849, The Positive View of Colonies and Economics, once again, still hanging around as late as Winston Churchill. And still blasting away with the guns in the Royal Navy as late as the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, but that was the last final gasp of the old colonials military conception. The positive view of colonies and economics, irrespective of economic sense, stated by Herman Merivale, 1841, quote, the peculiar and, in a certain sense of the word, unselfish interest with which schemes of colonization are regarded by almost all classes of society, the sanguine hopes we are apt to entertain of their success, the sacrifices we are willing to make for their promotion, even with little or no regard to the manner in which they may affect our economical prosperity at home. So it wasn't about money. people think the settling of the Canadian prairies or the Ontario bush was about money. It's absurd. There must have been, maybe for the stockholders of the Canadian Pacific Railway, but the people, plowing the sod and hacking the farms out of the bush, money was not the main thing. I don't know how it could have been. So even Knorr acknowledges, without going into the question of its merits, the existence of the spirit must be conceded. The turning of the tide wasn't necessarily with Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations. Rather, it dates from 1820, the free trade petition of the London merchants to the king. In 1821, Baltic timber duties were decreased. 1822, the navigation laws revised. And 1823, 1825, reciprocity initiated. So we give you these trade benefits. You give us the equivalent access to your market. Reciprocity. Ricardo mocks importance of the merchant marine. In 1821, David Ricardo opposed the view that the interest of the producer ought to be looked to, as well as that of the consumer, in legislative principles. Well, first of all, he mocking the merchant marine, saying that to give precedence to the shipping industry was basically like paying it to sail around Britain without doing anything. Or they might as well do that as well, keep Canada for the sake of the shipping industry. But then he also moves the emphasis to the consumer, that government policy should be for the consumer and not the exporter, not the manufacturer. In 1821, David Ricardo opposed the view that the interests of the producer ought to be looked to, as well as that of the consumer, in legislative principles. Ricardo, in short, defended the virtue of the laissez-faire system, according to which a consumer-oriented economy determined best how the available factors of production are used most economically. I'm skipping ahead here. See the light at the end of the tunnel here. But this stuff is obviously very current. Because the United States adopted the British classical economics view after World War II. That's why Adam Smith is still revered in conservative Republican circles and Democrat liberal circles. President Trump was out of the blue. Both parties in the US and the main parties in Canada are of the same opinion on this. They're for globalization. But once again, we have to realize the difference in interests between Britain, the United States, and Canada, the three main countries I'm looking at in this respect, and you can add Australia to that as well, which were the tensions that gave rise to the American Revolution. The economic interests of the United States are different than that of Britain and different than that of Canada. Whether they could be complementary is perhaps not necessary, except if it mutually benefited each of those countries, but particularly the United States and Canada are large countries with different regions within their federations. And the economic interests of the northern states, for example, was always on manufacturing and shipping, whereas the southern states was on agriculture and export. So they have different interests within the United States. And in Canada, central Canada, as the densely populated and manufacturing traditionally, of course, most of the Canadian factories shipped overseas, just like the American Midwest factories and Northeast factories. But Canada within itself also had different regions with different interests. Central Canada had an interest in manufacturing, whereas Western Canada was was um, commodities export, agriculture, forestry, um, and so was in the agricultural producing areas or in commodity areas are interested in free trade, whereas the manufacturing areas, the eastern United States, northeastern United States, and central Canada, were traditionally for the tariff. In Canada, that was the national policy of Sir John A. Macdonald to emphasize the manufacturing industries and protectionism to preference them. And in the United States, the northeastern states preferred the tariff and the southern states opposed it. So these discussions of free trade versus protectionism apply to the United States within itself, Canada within itself, not just Britain, but a lot of these ideas were thrashed out within the empire at this previous point with the rise of liberalism and Adam Smith. Um, so of course, Canada still maintained a relationship with Britain even after it developed its own continental economy, but you're dealing with uh, percentages of trade. We're not dealing with either or here. We're dealing with, in Canada, the percentage of trade would have been traditionally in the 19th century and early 20th century between its internal domestic economy, the United States, and Britain. And now nobody cares about any manufacturing or production because we're just printing money and getting people to sign printed money mortgages and building towers. So nobody cares about either manufacturing or agriculture or commodities at present. Just build giant malls and stuff people with McDonald's and cheap manufactured goods from other countries. Um, and don't do a damn thing besides get fat and sit and watch your bread and circuses. So nearing the end of the tunnel here, Britain's momentous decision in 1849 to repeal the Navigation Acts was facilitated by the propagandist endeavors of the Free Trade School, Manchesterism. But to a large extent, the fall of the navigation system was a logical sequence to the fall of the Corn Laws, whereby tariffs were reduced on agricultural, on grains imported into Britain. Repeal of the Corn Laws was in 1846. Repeal of the Navigation Acts, 1849. Big Trend. The Dismal Science. Disraeli, the conservative leader and the inveterate foe of the Liberal Party, was not a penny pincher, and says about Ricardo in 1847, when in 1847 J.L. Ricardo opened the attack on the Navigation Acts by moving for a parliamentary inquiry into their workings and effects, Disraeli declared that he and his friends would vote against this, not so much to defend the navigation system as to oppose the inquiry as such. That appeared to him a very novel and dangerous proposition to question the aristocrats, as it seemed to him that though investigation might be necessary in some cases, it was not a matter that should be morbidly encouraged on all occasions. Yeah, just quit nitpicking and analyzing everything and saying there's a big problem. So moving into the last, just a few words on the last quarter of the 19th century. All this book ends after the repeal of the Navigation Acts in 1850. Knorr characterizes the last quarter of the 19th century as the period during which Britain was apprehensive about the rise of rival continental economies. But he notes this fear of rival industrial economy made its first appearance in the 1830s. James Marriott reiterated the imperial preference as late as 1921, and as late as 1932. We have the Ottawa Agreements, where with the start of the Great Depression, the British Empire fell back on protectionist ideas. So that's not that long ago. But in the post-war period, the empire was scuttled by the British elites. Once again, Torrens was the outstanding theorist of the last stand, or in the 19th century, of the protectionist theories. And Britain's momentous decision in 1849 to repeal the Navigation Acts. England still the chief manufacturing country in the world in 1851. So free trade made sense at that point, but when other countries overtook them, maybe they started to think more about their previous colonial empire. And you got to wonder what's going on in Britain nowadays. The people, having voted for Brexit, must be just itching for a fight. Prestige and its considerate effect on overall international influence. This is a liberal Earl Grey. This is not to paint with a broad brush like the entire Liberal Party in Britain was of one opinion. They are individuals at that time, particularly, and different views and would vote against their party, and which is the subject of my book. On political party Hopefully it can be seen. And I encourage people to search for this on Amazon. On Political Party, an overview of select historical periods. It looks at the party system in 5 different historical periods in liberal democracies. But not all liberals, capital L liberals, were of the same opinion here. Earl Grey, I sure hope he was a liberal. I'm not going to Google that one, but Earl Grey held the same opinion. The possession of a number of steady and faithful allies in various quarters of the globe will surely be admitted to add greatly to the strength of the nation, nor ought it to be forgotten that the power of a nation does not depend merely on the amount of physical force it can command, but rests in no small degree upon opinion and moral influence. That's one aspect of the liberal party in the 19th century that's not penny pinching. They still had this moral influence aspect. In this respect, British power would be diminished by the loss of our colonies to a degree which would be difficult to estimate. So the Liberal Party was still nationalistic, and they just thought that free trade advanced that, which maybe it did at the time. In this country, this is, I've got to move ahead here. Lord John Russell, Liberal Prime Minister, British Prime Minister, wrote to Earl Grey in 1849, "The loss of any great portion of our colonies would diminish our importance in the world, and the vultures would soon gather together to despoil us of the other parts of our empire." Even Gladstone, who was extremely penny pinching, was not for the complete abandonment of the empire. However, the Manchester school, Cobden, Bright, were strictly for economic interest and low government expenditure and taxation on the manufacturers. In the sense of duty to a higher calling, also the Liberals retained that. In addition to considerations of power and prestige, statesmen like Peel, Gladstone, Lord John Russell, Earl Grey, and like-minded politicians and writers referred to the duty argument. Even if the maintenance of the imperial connection should involve material sacrifice, this duty should not be evaded. The maintenance of our connection with the colonies was to be regarded rather as a matter of duty than one of advantage. So you have to say that the Liberal Party was not all the same on this. The Manchester School, however, was Cobden and Bright, were quite cynical. And I'm going to come back and do last a chapter oddly that Knorr has on the lake poets. I have no idea. I'm glad that he included their opinions on all of this, as well as Thomas Carlyle. But it's amazing that he even thought of them. But I'm going to come back to that because it's so odd to hear the opinion of those writers on all of this. But they did have some opinions that they expressed. Nearing the end, it was mainly the propaganda campaign of the Manchester Party that secured the acceptance of free trade. This is also tied up with the rise of the middle class in Britain, as opposed to the rule of the aristocracy. And the same process occurred in Canada and the United States. So I assert that the pivotal question in this entire macro subject, and this is a very macro subject, Good heavens. 1570 to 1850 was the pivotal the pivotal question in this entire macro subject was the nuts and bolts of the British Empire, the economic parts of it. And as of the United States, traditional preferential trade within itself declined. Was it the result of overconfidence? For example, the decline of British manufacturing and shipping since the repeal of the Navigation Act in 1849 was more drawn out. But there's no doubt that eventually the British manufacturing declined and shipping. And there's no doubt now that US manufacturing declined after World War II, obviously later than Britain. The 20th century being the American century and not the 19th century being more the British century. But in the post-war example of the US is more stark and clear, allowing access to its large domestic market by Chinese manufacturing has decimated its manufacturing sector. I went to school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for a year, and I took the train from Pittsburgh to New York City, and I'll never forget simultaneously you saw all these huge abandoned factories um, in Pennsylvania. And then at other places, you'd see these gigantic malls being built. At the same time, these gigantic glittering, you know, malls. And the shift from production to consumption was stark. Um, and you have to say that the decline of the United States has been stark. There's neighborhoods in those American cities that if you go in them, you don't go in them. The locals don't go in them, let alone people visiting. Um, the decline is putting it mildly. It's approaching something worse than that. Um, and Canada's different, but as for the manufacturing areas in Ontario, what manufacturing areas? People asserted that England cannot afford to be little. The United States can't afford to be little, even more so. There's a cynicism about Cobden and Bright. There's a quote from Cobden in 1848. You may reason ever so logically, but never so convincingly as through the pocket. While it will take time even to play off John Bull's acquisitiveness against his combativeness, there's a consciously manipulating public opinion. Why? For their own self-interest? Their own political power? Or maybe they honestly believed in their ideology. Nor were the English people converted to the free trade cause on a rational and consequently durable basis. The victory of free trade agitation to a large extent, after the defeat of Corn Laws, was brought about by an unpopularity of a tax on bread. In retrospect, Cobden in 1860 called the free trade success, quote, lucky. Quote, to my eye, there seems a strange contempt for sober domestic politics among the English people. I'd consider that a positive trait, but I have often thought how lucky we were that when struggling for free trade in corn, the continent was slumbering under Louis Philippe's soporific reign, and that we had to deal with statesmen like Peel and Lord Aberdeen who were too honest and sedate to get up a war or foreign complications to divert attention from home. Oh boy. And the Americans have probably done the same thing. But that's self-interest certainly, but unabashed self-interest. Um, but um, John Stuart Mill also remarked, 1861, I had learned from experience that many false opinions may be changed for true ones without in the least altering the habits of mind of which false opinions are the result. Condescending once again. The English public, for example, are quite as raw and undiscerning on subjects of political economy since the nation has been converted to free trade as they were before, and are still further from having acquired better habits of thought or feeling, or being in any way better fortified against error on subject of a more elevated character. For though they have thrown off certain errors, the general discipline of their minds, intellectually and morally, is not altered. Very condescending. So you could conclude that what Cobden, and certainly Cobden in his where he says, you may reason ever so logically but never so convincingly as through the pocket. It will take time even to play off John Bull's acquisition against his competitiveness. Playing off. So what's his goal there? His goal appears to be political power. So what Cobden is saying is that the goal was political power for himself and his colleagues by appealing to greed of the middle classes, or as he terms it, acquisitiveness. Cynical, contemptuous of the people, and yet the Liberal Party profess to be the voice of the middle class. And yet you read their private correspondence, it's quite stunning. At least Disraeli was openly aristocratic. Although he actually was something of a demagogue probably too from time to time. Cynical, contemptuous of the people. But the Whigs demurred. The Whigs left the Liberal Party at a certain point because of Gladstone's extreme critique of the British Empire in England. So this is the Liberal Party, not the Whigs. The 20th century and the larger example of the US outside this book and in Canada. But I'm going to go back and read what the Lake Poets and Thomas Carlyle had to say about all this free trade stuff. It's quite funny. Briefly. So, the Lake Poets disliked not only the materialistic spirit, they also were prejudiced against economy in the production of wealth. Quote, what solemn humbug this modern political economy is, Coleridge said in his Table Talk. Political economy, moreover, seemed vicious in its tendency to dissolve the irrational bonds that integrated national society. The entire tendency, this is Coleridge speaking or writing, quote, the entire tendency of modern or Malthusian political economy is to denationalize. This is very current because this talk of Malthusianism is swirling around some of the critiques of the globalist health government, whatever this is. So this talk, Coleridge is very, and that this process of that Malthusian political economy tends to denationalize. That's globalization in 2023, and he says this in 1830. In his works, I'm not sure when Coleridge is writing that. And Coleridge goes on, the nation that cannot even exist without the commodity of another nation is in fact the slave of that other nation. Canada vis-a-vis China, the United States vis-a-vis China, the slave of that other nation. It's strong. As for Thomas Carlyle, I think this is my final quote here. Thomas Carlyle extolled the virtues of strong leadership by aristocrats. Laissez-faire was viewed as being at bottom, quote, as good as an abdication on the part of the governors, unquote, or, quote, self-canceling do-nothingism, unquote. Laissez-faire rule, Carlyle maintained, had a tendency to bring about the disintegration of society by dissolving traditional bonds and by leaving its individual members without any ties to each other except that of the, quote, the sole nexus, unquote, of cash payments. That's sounding technocratic and very prophetic. There's some other good quotes actually from Carlyle here. His contemporaries' excessive quest for material wealth signified to him that they followed, quote, the gospel of mammon, unquote, and that free trade, quote, the immense and universal question of cheap and nasty, unquote, was a substitute for religion. Once again, very current. In 1830, he wrote about the classical economists. Quote, their whole philosophy is an arithmetical computation. Computers. Computation, he says in 1830. Performed in words. Their whole philosophy is an arithmetical computation performed in words. Even if it were right, which it scarcely ever is, the question of national money-making is not a high but a low one. As they treat it amongst the lowest, political philosophy should be a scientific revelation of the whole secret mechanism whereby men cohere in society, instead of which it tells us how flannel jackets are exchanged for pork hams, unquote. So on that note, I'll end this book review, and we'll just finally list some recent secondary sources for people who want to read more on these periods and ideas. This is from John Darwin's further reading section. The first is by A. Porter, Porter, in his work Bibliography of Imperial, Colonial, and Commonwealth History since 1600, published Oxford, 2022. That's A. Porter, Bibliography of Imperial, Colonial, and Commonwealth History since 1600. Has some 24,000 entries, many running to dozens of volumes. Be somewhere to find something on anything here. Conceptually, the study of British imperial expansion begins with the classic and irreplaceable essay by J. Gallagher and R. Robinson, quote, The Imperialism of Free Trade, unquote, in Economic History Review, 2nd Series, Volume 6, 1953. That's in Economic History Review, 2nd Series, Volume 6, 1953. The Imperialism of Free Trade. As a comparison, it's not talking about the British Empire all the time. He lists the work on the Russian Empire. D. Lieven, that's Lieven, Lieven, quote, Empire, the Russian Empire and its rivals, London 2023. Empire, the Russian Empire and its rivals. The British Empire and the Russian Empire. Once again, it sounds pretty current. Although the British Empire doesn't really exist. And yet the Russians seem to still think it does. Putin talks about the Anglo-Saxons. And who's giving all the weapons and money to Ukraine? So there's still some kind of force there. Mainly the United States, obviously, but then another is A.P. Thornton, The Imperial Idea and Its Enemies. That's London, 1959. A grand overview. And then once again, he says that Knorr's British Colonial Theories, 1570 to 1850, a marvelous compendium. E.F. Heckscher's, Heckscher, Heckssher, yeah. Mercantilism, 2 volumes, London, 1935. So there's a monograph on mercantilism. Heckscher. A.C. Howe, Howe, Free Trade in Liberal England, Oxford, 1997. D.H. Sachs, Sacks, The Widening Gate, Bristol and the Atlantic Economy, 1450 to 1700, Berkeley, 1991. The significance of the triangle trade between Britain, West Africa, and the Caribbean can be followed in S. Mintz, Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History, 1985. Because it has to be attention drawn to the West African connection to the Atlantic trade loop, which involved slavery. Although the northern colonies in Canada didn't participate in that, but it can't be forgotten here. But once again, I'm just relating economic theories, and this is not a social history. R. Paris, Pares, quote, Economic Factors in the History of the Empire, in Economic History Review, Volume 7, 1937. That's Pares, Economic Factors in the Histories of Empire. Economic Factors in the History of the Empire, Economic History Review. J.G. William, Globalization in History, The Evolution of a 19th Century Atlantic Economy. William, Globalization in History. London and Cambridge, Mass. 1999. S. Chapman, The Rise of Merchant Banking. That's in the finance side. That's Chapman, The Rise of Merchant Banking. And A. Dilley, Dilley, Finance, Politics and Imperialism, Australia, Canada, and the City of London, 1896 to 1914. D. Hedrick, Headrick, The Tools of Empire, Technology and European Imperialism in the 19th Century, Oxford, 1981. J.T. Otte, O-T-T-E, and Nielsen, Neilson, editors, Railways and International Politics, Paths of Empire, 1948 to 1945. the railways being an industry that grew in importance as the 19th century progressed. So there we go. Klaus E. Knorr. I've read it, so you don't have to. Join me next time for my next book review on the Non-Philistine Book Review podcast. Rumble. Are we live? Rumble. Start rumbling. Please, Rumble. Please. Start rumbling. Rumble. Please, oh, please, oh, please. Rumble, rumble, rumble. Please, oh, please, oh, please. Start to work. Yes. Yes, you are working. Haha. Okay. Welcome, world. To the Non-Philistine Book Review podcast. Today I'm going to review my first book, British Colonial Theories, 1570 to 1850 by Klaus E. Knorr. Hopefully I can get that centered. Maybe move it over this way. Just figuring out this camera and everything else. Nope, the other way. Where's the freaking camera on this thing? Aha. There we go. Okay. So you've seen the title. This book was published in 1944, and it's quite a complicated book. But I was encouraged to hear Mr. John Darwin say that, who is the author of The Global Expansion of Britain, published more recently, that he mentions Knorr in his further reading. And he says that K. Knorr, British Colonial Theories, is a marvelous compendium. And I read that after I had read the book, so I'm glad to hear him confirm that the book was worth reading from an academic perspective, because Darwin is much more qualified than I am to say that. But I'm just going to confirm, if I shut this volume off, that so I don't have to hear myself because it's talking back to me. Can you still hear me now that the volume on Rumble is muted? Can you still hear me? think I'm going to have to do that, otherwise I'm going to keep hearing myself. Okay, so I'm back.